So we'll talk about environmental anchors. So the things like, that will link you in either visually or things that you hear or something like that we associate with doing a certain task that will keep us in. We'll talk about adrenaline and how we can set ourselves up for that, the Pomodoro being one of them, like we talked about a bit last week. Having other people around and the benefits that can have. Gamifying life just to make things a bit more interesting and hijack our dopamine system in a positive way. Reminders and planning. Picking your best time to work. And even the benefit of some things that we might not see as beneficial, like fidgeting. And we'll get to that as we go. All right, so start your Pomodoro timers. Now remember, we're going to kind of bunch up the session like that and have times of faster talking with a bit more chill time in between. So this is generally to set a timer. In this case, we're not specifically going to, but it's to focus or concentrate on the task really intently for a small period of time, knowing that we're going to have a break in between each of those kind of bouts. All right, so environmental anchors. So all of our minds wander without us realizing. And we, as in our brains, without us consciously realizing, will look for in the environment cues of what we're actually doing before we actually consciously realize. And this isn't just people with ADHD, this is everyone. And it's an important note to recognize so that we can set ourselves up for the best kind of environment to keep us going. So a task like the one in the picture, like where you're digging a hole, at any given moment, if you were to kind of space out for a second and your brain's like, well, what am I doing again? You see that you've got, well, in that case, other people around, but even without that, you've got a shovel in your hand. You can see that there's a half dug hole in front of you. The same with like doing the dishes or something like that. Once you get started with something like that, there's, natural kind of anchors in the task to keep us going. But there are plenty of things that we do as well, particularly in this modern world, where we don't necessarily have environmental anchors that are kind of keep us going without us setting them up. So like anything you're going to do on a computer, for example, there are a whole bunch of different things that we do and we can do with our computers, including entertainment and stuff like that, but also work. And because we do those different things with it, just having the computer in front of us isn't going to be enough to tell us that we're specifically doing work. Setting ourselves up with like a clean desk space or something like that so that we're narrowed into it, or even utilizing in some cases for like linear tasks, like I was talking about last week, it can be beneficial to have like, an egg timer or something like that we're using during those times. Any of these things, whether they're things that we're hearing like the of the egg timer, or just seeing a clear space that we're sitting perhaps in front of our desk versus somewhere more relaxed. These are all anchors that can keep us into a task versus kind of getting stuck into something. We might be, 15, 20, 30 minutes doing that other thing before we realize that, oh, wait, like that's not what we were trying to do during that time. We've gotten sidetracked. Setting up the anchors can be a good way to decrease the chances of that happening. All right, so adrenalizing the system in the last minute effect. When our brain is on adrenaline, we get those benefits of having higher, or we get those attributes. I shouldn't just say benefits because they're not always beneficial. Those attributes of higher norepinephrine. So the narrowed focus, making strong decisions and following that without getting sidetracked into other things where everything kind of seems like a high priority, and priority convergence where we, in that same kind of way, we're very clear on what we're doing compared with other things. And we'll do that for a long period of time, potentially, if we need to, without getting sidetracked into something that seems potentially more interesting at that time. Now, the last minute pattern is something that those of us with ADHD kind of tend to develop over time, because when, let's say that I've got, a recent example, let's say that I've got a bunch of slides or something like that I've got to do. And this could be kind of anything, an assignment or what have you. Now, before it's actually due, before we know that we must do it then and there, or it won't happen, right? Or there's going to be some consequences. We can't necessarily convince ourselves, at least it's not as easy to convince ourselves that we must do it and that no other time is going to work out just as well. And that's why we tend to develop a last minute pattern. It's not necessarily beneficial, of course, because we give ourselves less time for it. We can beat ourselves up and stress out about it beforehand. So it's good to come up with other ways to potentially combat that, but that's what we will naturally kind of gravitate to. So creating the last minute effect. Now, this can be by actually setting up or agreeing on earlier timeframes that we want to get things done, particularly if you're doing like a really long-term task. Like, let's say if you were doing a thesis or something like that, right? Then in that case, there's, one huge chunk of work that you have a very long time to deliver. To break that down and to have points where you've agreed, where it's like, well, perhaps with your supervisor to deliver a certain amount before, by a certain date, that can give us the last minute effect where we know there is some actual accountability with another person, and we would have to have a chat with them, whatever it is, to explain things if we didn't get it done by that time. Setting up some accountability is a good way to do this. The Pomodoro technique is another way of essentially adrenalizing our system in a similar way, as though there was that last minute effect that will kind of bring it on naturally. But in general, non-negotiable deadlines, Pomodoro, getting revved up at that time. There are other ways of adrenalizing our system, like one of the advantages of doing exercise, particularly in the morning, that's going to rev us up a bit. That gives us a window. They've actually done research where 30 minutes of high intensity cardiovascular exercise for people with ADHD gives us about a 2-hour window thereafter where we can, get focused on stuff just as readily on average as the average person without ADHD. So it can be quite beneficial to do exercise and stuff like that at times before we need to get revved up and do stuff. Now, having other people around. So of course it can provide an anchor to our task. If say, like that kind of study group in the picture, you've got other people around, it's very clear what the task is that you're doing together, because you wouldn't be, say, sitting in the university library alongside, people who are studying a certain subject with you, unless you were doing something related to that. At the same time, it's accountability to perhaps be doing something, related to it or get a certain amount done, but also to to not be slouching in our chair or kind of watching Netflix or whatever it is that we might be doing if there's just no one around, no one to be accountable to. There's also kind of the lack of loneliness and understimulation, like there's other stuff going on, which some people with ADHD might find more challenging. Like if all of those sounds are potentially quite distracting, but if they're not too distracting, they pull us into it completely, then those can be advantageous where they're filling up a little bit of that need for stimulation in the background so that we can stay committed to a task that isn't necessarily, high intensity interesting at that time. There's also just more reasons to rein ourselves in, as I was talking about with the accountability point. Hyperfocus. So we talked about that a little bit last time. Hyperfocus happens when you were genuinely interested in things. Now, hyperfocus includes losing track of time, and it is important to use reminders to do other things like, sleep and meeting people and whatever it is. Like, let's say that there's a task that, now this could even be unproductive stuff. Well, things that we don't consider productive, like social networks or, YouTube or something like that we might get really pinned in on. If we know that we're really interested in certain topics, to realize, hey, that's something I could hyper focus on. which is both a good thing if we really want to get stuff done in that area, but also something we need to be aware of if we don't want to spend forever on that one given task. So it can be a good idea, particularly if we wanted to do that in the morning and then get out and do some other stuff later, to actually have, a reminder or an alarm or something like that to pull us out of it, so that we don't end up doing that to the point of, going to bed way later than we want, or not meeting people in time, or whatever it is. But genuine interest, it can be guided. Now, not everything necessarily is going to be conducive to getting really genuinely interested in it. But for those tasks that are, it is a matter then of of finding what is that thing that's going to pull me into it, so that I don't have to force my focus on it, which might make it feel like a chore or kind of aversive if that's the primary way that we're making ourselves focus on it. So instead of, say, just being like, okay, I'm going to use Pomodoro on this thing that I've got to, say, research or read or whatever it is, and I'm going to just get into this, which would be the way of adrenalizing ourselves to do it. But that does require, a certain amount of extra effort, and won't necessarily spur us on to do something for a longer period of time where we're really intensely into it. Instead, it could be a good idea to, potentially talk to other people who are really into the task that you've talked to in the past when you were passionate about it. If, say, it's, a thesis or a big task, or, something that you've shared the interest in with other people in your life. It could be, watching TED Talks or stuff on YouTube for a small amount of time that relate to that, to pull your focus into it so that you can get a large bout of actually really getting stuff done in that area. But there are some ways of guiding it, like I said, if we are doing tasks that are conducive to getting really interested. And just to bring those slides all together, this kind of trifecta, where we've got a Venn diagram here that has the high interest, the looming disaster, or something where we get adrenalized into, and having other people around. It's not just a matter of having one or the other. There are often times when we can pull them all together and have, either two or even three of these working all together with stuff. So like, to combine, say, high interest with having other people around, that could be something like where perhaps you do have other people who are really interested in the task as well, or people who perhaps you want to, help learn about it, and you do have that fascination. Having the other people to pull in the accountability so that you'll really get into that mode of getting spurred into learning more and more. That would be a way of combining two of those. And this can require getting creative, but just realizing that we can utilize more than one of these, and the more the merrier if it's the right kind of task. Okay. Ready, set, Pomodoro. So making boring things better. Now, of course, there are a few different ways that we can do this, but setting up some kind of rewards or gamifying the situation can be really beneficial, particularly with tasks that are just not that interesting, not that fun kind of for anyone. Like, just imagine like doing the dishes, right? This isn't something that for most of us, we're likely to get really excited about at any stage. But if we can set it up where, like, let's say you've got a housemate or you live with your partner and you both don't enjoy doing the dishes, which isn't that unlikely to come by, then perhaps setting up a situation where you're like, when you've done the dishes last, you could have your names on a posted slide each, right? And they're stuck somewhere near where you do the dishes. And then when you've done it, you get to move your name further away, knowing that the next person who has to do it, they're the person who's closest. There are different ways to potentially do this to just give us a little bit more of a bonus, of a feeling like we've achieved when we actually get that thing done. So reward yourself by completing tasks and withhold rewards if you didn't do it. Now, this can be a good thing, particularly when it's just like being consistent with something over time, racing yourself, having a housemate or a friend to get stuff done, you know, set it up so that there's something a bit more deliberate. Even if you like, say if you've got another friend who has similar issues, then you can help them out, they help you out. There's something a bit more communal about it and more fun. Reminders and planning. So now it's important to remember that planning is a task too, and it's often overlooked. For neurotypical people, that's not necessarily so much, well, it's always going to be something that is important to do, particularly with like large tasks, da 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 da. But for us in particular, planning might be the least interesting part of it, and it might be the most the part of it that we're most likely to skip over. Pulling back and just realizing if we can chunk up our time, we can set up and come up with like deadlines for ourselves through doing that, which we can set up through accountability, but that requires a bit of planning so that we know when we're doing it, we're setting up those times that we're going to be contributing to the task as times that we know when we're not otherwise occupied, stuff like that. Really, really crucial to making sure that we get things done. Just move these across a little bit. Now starting. So I did have a slide on this. So this is what I was talking about just in our last little break. Starting is often the hardest because starting is tied to the whole thing. Now, starting as its own task, what we can do is kind of separate that out so that as a very small period of time, that's not a very big daunting task or anything like that. We open up the documents that are related to it. If it's a computer related task, put in the title, maybe paste the details to form the structure, make sure everything's open. And then we can come back to it either the next day or after we have a snack or go for a walk or whatever it is, so that that separate part that otherwise might end up leading to us kind of, getting stuck or not even starting it, like not even kind of getting into the overall task that we want to, that we're separating that out and doing it as its own little task. So then when we sit down to do the task, we've gotten rid of a lot of that kind of base daunting stuff. Picking your time of day. So everyone has different times of day that they know that they're going to be their most productive. And it's very tempting, I guess, or kind of intuitive to potentially do the tasks that we find that we know are like most complicated, the most overall challenging to do, perhaps the most high level tasks that we've got to do, we might do during those times in the day that we know that we're at our best because we want to do well at those tasks. The overall most difficult things for people with ADHD are often the things that are least interesting, which are often the things that are not the most complex things that we've got to do throughout a day. And we've got to kind of pick those tasks that are the least interesting, are the most difficult to rev ourselves up and get to do it, and to place those at the times that we're at our best. So ask yourself, what time of day are you most productive? Some people say that this is like, first thing in the morning, could be 6 a.m., maybe not for all of us. Some people, it's say 11 to 1 or something like that. But like, if you just think of, say, your work day, or if you're studying, like in general, what time throughout the day, when do you have your best hours that you could kind of get anything done regardless of what it is? And then have a think of, what do you normally, when you've got a bunch of different things that you've got to do, what do you normally place in those times? And could that be done a bit more optimally for your situation? As in, like, do you tend to put the most complex things that you've got to do in those times and then maybe really struggle to get to the less interesting things later? In which case, it would be better to switch that around a bit so that during those hours that that you'll kind of focus on anything that you need to, that you're putting in those tasks that are the least interesting, the most difficult to get done for you, not the most complex necessarily. And if you take medication, how long after it kicks in are you most focused? This is another way of kind of thinking, well, maybe it takes an hour to kick in. Maybe there's a window of 2 to 3 hours after it's actually kicked in that that you're receiving the benefits of it to the max. And then you can, place during that time or try to get going with something that's not particularly interesting as it's revving up so that you're already in it by the time it does. Another note is don't dismiss a time to start on something because you don't have enough time to complete it. Starting is a task, remember. So like sometimes we'll be like, I've got this task. I know it's going to take me at least a couple of hours. I've only got, half an hour up my sleeve. So no, I won't do that. I'll just finish early. Set yourself up for the next time you're going to be sitting down and doing that task. Whatever that happens to be. I gave the example in the last slide of opening up stuff on the computer to do with it, closing down things on the computer. It could be cleaning your desk. It could be like anything that's going to mean that the next time you sit down to do that particular task, there's less stuff in your way to getting started with it. It just relates very much to understanding how when we kind of pull up Facebook or we pull up YouTube or something like that, they aren't just kind of showing us what's on today or what have you. They have recommendation algorithms algorithms to recommend you stuff based on a whole extremely thorough assessment of your personality over time based on what you've paid attention to, what you've hovered over, what you've clicked on. That is extremely accurate to the point that ADHD or not, and we're a bit more potentially getting pulled down into it, that we may not have total control, over that AI controlling us to pull out of it. And it may take some time to actually do that. Might be half an hour of kind of just zombie scrolling before we actually pull out of it. And if we understand that up front, then we can do a couple things like to make sure that we're not getting into those kind of attention traps when we know that we've got to go out in 20 minutes or something. There are apps that there are plugins that you can get that will stop them from popping up, or say on Facebook, it'll stop the feed from coming up if you just wanted to check your notifications and stuff like that. One that I've used in the past is called Feed Eradicator. Before next session, I'd like you to note down actually, and we can go back through some of the slides if you want to pick some, but note down at least 3 of these techniques to do your most mundane procrastinating kind of challenges. So if you're studying, they probably relate to that. If you're working and you've got stuff, that may not be the most fun that you've got to get done, try a couple of these techniques. So remember, if we go back, Pomodoro is one of them. So if you haven't tried the Pomodoro technique before, give that a try. You don't actually need to buy an egg timer, although if you found that you liked the Pomodoro technique, having that physical egg timer can give you that kind of, like some of those things to anchor you into that situation. By the way, the next one is having environmental anchors. This can be something that you set up, say when you're doing particular types of work, to have, it could be an arbitrary thing. It could be that you literally put like a little fluffy monster teddy bear in front of you when you're doing the work, so that you end up developing that association with doing the work. And your mind's like, what am I doing again? Ah, yes, I've got my spelling bee monster there. I'm coming up with stuff here, but this is something that you could potentially apply to whatever you want. Now, adrenalizing the system can be done in different ways. Like I was talking about before, setting up non-negotiable deadlines with yourself, or with, say, a buddy that you're doing stuff with. Or if you've got, say, a supervisor for a thesis or something like that, actually telling them that you'll have things like parts of the assignment done earlier so that you've got some kind of deal with them and you know that you would have to explain yourself if you didn't otherwise do that. Having other people around. So that could be, deliberately maybe meeting a friend and going to the library, or, you know, it really depends on what the task is, but you can think of how that might make things a bit more conducive to getting done, and actually set up like a time that you can try these things throughout the week as well. The other one is, if you're doing things that you sometimes get really interested in and like hyper focus on, but not always, think about what might pull you into being able to like really kind of get narrowed into it again. That could be, talking to people who you know are really fascinated about it. Watching something that kind of glorifies it or gets you excited about it, or you associate with times that you were really passionate about it. Again, high interest, some kind of looming disaster or adrenalizing yourself, having other people around. And then, it could be rewarding yourself. I would suggest rewarding yourself with something that, isn't going to get in the way of other goals, like something really unhealthy or something like that. But making something more interesting, either in some kind of competitive or quasi-competitive way with a friend or with yourself, or potentially setting up a reward, like, I'm going to let myself do this if I get this done. Or to be, and I would highly recommend that this potentially be one of them that you try today, is whatever you plan to do, set yourself a reminder. Make sure, like, pick a time ideally throughout the week, or, that you're unlikely to have other competing activities that are either more interesting or that are must-dos at that time. And that when that goes off, that you'll be keen to actually get it done. And it can be a really good idea. One of the other things that you can try is to pick that time of day when you otherwise might do the most kind of complex, which might be the most interesting things that you've got to do throughout the day, but to pick the time of day instead that you feel your best to get anything done, to do the stuff that feels least interesting, knowing that even if the other tasks are more complex and may require, like, maybe harder for the average person to get done, if you're interested in them more than those kind of less interesting tasks, for you, it's likely that you'll get those done anyway. You want to get done the things that are the least interesting, the hardest to rev yourself up to do during the time that you're best throughout the day. Thanks so much, guys.